Pablo Escobar grabbed the chemist by the collar and slammed him face first into a wooden table covered in coca paste. The man's nose cracked against the surface, and a cloud of white powder exploded into the humid jungle air. What happened in the next 48 hours inside that hidden laboratory would become Colombian underworld legend, a story whispered about for decades by traffickers, sicarios, and DEA agents who could never quite confirm whether it was real or myth. But I'm telling you right now, it was real. Let me take you back. This is 1983, deep in the jungle outside Puerto Triunfo. Pablo Escobar is not yet the man on the cover of every magazine. He's building. He's hungry. He's moving between 20 and 30 tons of cocaine per month through a network that stretches from the Amazon basin to Miami Beach. And to do that, he needs labs. Not one lab, dozens, hidden deep in the jungle canopy where Colombian military helicopters can't spot them from the air. Each lab is a small factory staffed by armed guards, runners, and most importantly, chemists. The chemists are the backbone. Without them, coca leaves are just plants. With them, those leaves become powder worth more than gold. Now here's the thing. Nobody tells you about Pablo's operation at this stage. He didn't control it through loyalty. Not yet. He controlled it through sheer volume. He had so many labs running simultaneously that if one got raided, he'd lose product but not the operation. The problem with running that many labs is you can't be everywhere. You have to trust people. And Pablo Escobar, even at 33 years old, already understood that trust was the most expensive currency in the drug trade. The lab we're talking about sat 12 miles east of Hacienda Nápoles, Pablo's famous estate with the zoo and the dinosaur statues at the front gate. This particular lab was his crown jewel, not because it was the biggest, because it produced the purest product. 96% purity, that's almost unheard of. Street cocaine in Miami at the time averaged maybe 60% on a good day. Pablo's chemists at this lab were producing pharmaceutical-grade cocaine, and the American distributors were paying a premium for it. This single lab was generating roughly $4 million per week in raw product value before it even hit the supply chain. The head chemist was a man named Rodrigo Lara Velázquez, no relation to the justice minister. Rodrigo was 41, thin, with thick glasses that made him look like a university professor who'd taken a very wrong turn in life. And in a way, that's exactly what he was. He'd studied chemical engineering in Bogota, worked for a pharmaceutical company, got fired for skimming precursor chemicals, and wound up cooking for the cartels because nobody else would hire him. Rodrigo was brilliant, genuinely brilliant. He developed a proprietary refinement process that used less ether, less acetone, and produced higher purity. Believe me, in the cocaine world, that's the equivalent of inventing a new engine. Everyone wants it. Nobody else can replicate it. And Rodrigo knew his value. That was the problem. Over the course of several months, Pablo's lieutenants started reporting back disturbing information. Rodrigo was skimming. Not a lot, maybe 2 kilos per batch. But 2 kilos per batch across dozens of batches adds up to real money. More than that, Rodrigo was selling the skimmed product directly to a rival buyer connected to the Cali cartel. He was feeding Pablo's competition with Pablo's own cocaine, refined in Pablo's own lab, under Pablo's own protection. Now get this, that alone would be a death sentence. Pablo had killed men for less, much less. A driver once shortchanged a delivery by half a kilo and turned up in 3 separate garbage bags along the Medellin River. But Rodrigo wasn't just stealing. He was organizing. Pablo's cousin and trusted enforcer, Gustavo Gaviria, received a tip from a lab guard in late February. Rodrigo had been holding meetings. Late at night, after the production shifts ended, he'd gather the other chemists, 4 of them in total, plus a handful of guards he'd been paying bonuses to out of his own pocket. The message Rodrigo was spreading was simple. He told the men that Pablo needed them more than they needed Pablo. He said they were the ones with the knowledge. They were the ones taking the real risk, breathing in toxic fumes 12 hours a day, while Pablo sat in his mansion watching soccer. Rodrigo's pitch was straightforward. They would break away, take the proprietary process, set up their own lab, sell directly to the Cali people at a higher margin, and if Pablo came after them, they'd have enough armed men and enough leverage to negotiate. Gustavo brought this information to Pablo at Hacienda Nápoles on a Tuesday evening. Pablo was sitting by his pool, his 2-year-old son on his lap. Gustavo laid it out, every detail, The skimming, the meetings, the Cali connection, the plan to defect. Pablo didn't react immediately. He set his son down gently on a lounge chair, kissed the boy's forehead, and stood up. He walked to the edge of the pool. His jaw tightened. His hands went flat against his thighs, pressing down hard, the way a man does when he's containing something volcanic. Then he turned to Gustavo and said 6 words. "How many guards does he have?" Gustavo said, 8, maybe 10. Pablo nodded once. "I'll go myself." Gustavo tried to talk him out of it. This is what Gustavo always did. He was the cautious one, the businessman, the one who calculated risk versus reward. He told Pablo to send a team. Send 30 sicarios, burn the lab, kill everyone inside, rebuild somewhere else. It was cleaner, safer, smarter. Pablo shook his head. If I send men, he's a dead man. If I go myself, he's a lesson. Here's what you need to understand about Pablo Escobar in this period. He wasn't just building a drug empire. He was building a mythology. Every decision he made was calculated not just for its immediate effect, but for the story it would tell afterward. He understood something that most criminals never figure out. Fear doesn't come from violence alone. Fear comes from the stories people tell about violence, and the best stories always have the boss in the room. So Pablo went himself. He took Gustavo, his brother Roberto, and 6 sicarios. They loaded into 2 Toyota Land Cruisers and drove out before dawn. The road to the lab wasn't really a road. It was a dirt path cut through jungle so thick that the canopy blocked out the sun even at noon. The Land Cruisers could only make it about 8 miles in before the path narrowed to nothing. After that, they walked. Pablo Escobar, the man who owned a fleet of private jets and submarines, was hiking through mud in rubber boots carrying an automatic rifle slung across his chest. I swear this happened. Multiple former associates confirmed this over the years, independently to journalists and later to prosecutors. They reached the perimeter of the lab compound around 10 in the morning. The lab itself was a series of connected structures, mostly wooden frames with plastic sheeting for walls and corrugated tin roofs. There were 3 main processing buildings, a storage shed, a bunkhouse for the workers, and a generator shack. The whole thing was surrounded by a loose perimeter of guards, but Pablo's intelligence was accurate. Rodrigo had been paying off guards, which meant some of them were loyal to the chemist, not the boss, but not all of them. And in a jungle lab, you never quite know who's holding a gun for whom until the shooting starts. Pablo crouched behind a fallen tree and studied the layout. He turned to one of his sicarios, a man named Popeye who would later become infamous in his own right, and told him to take 3 men and circle around to the north side. Cut off the escape route. Nobody leaves the compound. Nobody. Popeye moved without a word. Pablo waited 15 minutes. Then he stood up, stepped out of the tree line, and walked straight toward the main gate of the compound. No cover, no crouching, no tactical approach. He just walked. This is the part that separates Pablo from every other drug lord who ever lived. The audacity, the sheer theatrical nerve. He walked toward a compound full of men who were actively plotting against him, carrying his rifle loosely at his side, not even raised, as if he were strolling into a restaurant for lunch. The first guard to spot him froze. Literally couldn't move. His cigarette fell out of his mouth. He recognized Pablo immediately. Everyone in the organization knew Pablo's face. The guard's rifle was leaning against a tree 3 feet away, and he didn't reach for it. He just stood there. Pablo walked past him without a glance. A second guard came around the corner of the bunkhouse, saw Pablo, and dropped to his knees. Not because Pablo told him to, because his legs gave out. That's genuine terror. Your body overrides your brain. Now here's where it gets complicated. A third guard, one of the men Rodrigo had been paying, did raise his weapon. He lifted an old M1 carbine and pointed it directly at Pablo's chest from about 40 feet away. Pablo stopped walking. He looked at the man. He didn't raise his own weapon. He didn't shout. He tilted his head slightly to the left and said, "You know who I am." It wasn't a question. The guard's hands were shaking so badly the barrel of the carbine was bouncing up and down. Pablo took 1 step forward, then another. He closed the distance to 30 feet, 25. The guard's finger was on the trigger, but the man's entire body was trembling. Pablo said, Put it down, and you walk out of this jungle alive. The carbine hit the dirt. Trust me on this. Courage and loyalty are very different things. Rodrigo could pay men bonuses. He could promise them a bigger cut. But he couldn't give them what Pablo gave people, pure, bone-deep certainty that crossing him meant death, not just for you, but for everyone you loved. Pablo stepped over the dropped carbine and walked toward the main processing building. By now, the commotion had alerted everyone in the compound. Workers were scattering. Some ran for the tree line. Popeye's men caught them and herded them back. Others just sat down wherever they were, hands visible, heads low, trying to disappear into the mud. Roberto Escobar and Gustavo entered from the east side with the remaining sicarios. Within 4 minutes, the entire compound was secured. No shots fired, not one. The takeover was so clean it was almost anticlimactic. Almost. Because Rodrigo was still inside the main processing building. And he wasn't alone. Pablo pushed through the plastic sheeting that served as a door and stepped into the lab. The air inside was thick with chemical fumes. Ether, acetone. The kind of atmosphere that burns your eyes and coats the inside of your throat. Processing tables lined both walls, covered with trays of coca paste in various stages of refinement. At the far end of the building, standing behind the largest table, was Rodrigo, and around him, arranged in a loose semicircle, were the 4 other chemists. They were holding machetes. Not guns, machetes. Long, curved blades used for cutting jungle brush and, when necessary, for cutting people. Rodrigo pushed his thick glasses up his nose with one hand. In his other hand, he held a glass beaker filled with sulfuric acid. Now picture this. Pablo Escobar is standing 10 feet from 5 men with machetes and a beaker of acid. Behind him are Gustavo and Roberto, both armed, but the space is tight. Shooting in a room full of ether fumes and chemical solvents is essentially lighting a bomb. Everyone in that building knew it. You fire a weapon in there, the muzzle flash could ignite the fumes and turn the entire structure into a fireball. Rodrigo knew this. That's why he chose to make his stand inside the lab. It was his insurance policy. His dead man's switch. He looked at Pablo and said, "You can't shoot in here. You know what happens if you do." Pablo lowered his rifle slowly and set it on the ground. He straightened up and looked at Rodrigo with an expression that witnesses later described as almost calm, almost peaceful. Rodrigo kept talking. He was nervous. You could see it in the way his hand trembled around the beaker. But he was committed. He said, "I built this lab. I created the process. Every kilo that made you rich came from my hands, my knowledge. You're nothing without men like me. You're just a thug from Envigado with a big mouth. Listen to me." Those words, in that jungle, in that moment, were the most dangerous sentence anyone had ever spoken to Pablo Escobar's face. Pablo didn't move. Not yet. He let the words hang in the chemical air. Then he did something nobody expected. He laughed. Not a big laugh. A short, quiet breath of amusement through his nose. The kind of laugh that has absolutely no warmth in it. He took one step forward. Rodrigo raised the beaker higher. "I'll throw this in your face. I swear to God I will." Pablo took another step. He was now 6 feet from the table, close enough that if Rodrigo threw the acid, there was no dodging it. The chemists on either side shifted their grips on the machetes. The room was a pressure cooker. And then Pablo did the thing that made this story a legend. He reached up with both hands and unbuttoned his shirt. Slowly, button by button. He pulled it open, exposing his bare chest. Then he spread his arms wide, palms open, and said, "Throw it." Dead silence. Rodrigo's hand was shaking so badly now that small drops of acid were spilling over the rim of the beaker, hitting the table and hissing where they landed. Pablo took another step. 5 feet now. "Go ahead. You said I'm nothing. Prove it. Throw the acid. Swing the machete. Do something. This is the moment. Right here." This is where everything shifted. Because Rodrigo could have thrown it. Physically, mechanically, he could have snapped his wrist and sent that sulfuric acid directly into Pablo Escobar's face. It would have disfigured him, blinded him, changed the entire history of the Medellin cartel. But Rodrigo didn't throw it. You want to know why? Here's what nobody ever talks about when they tell this story. Rodrigo didn't freeze because of fear alone. He froze because of what throwing the acid would mean for the seconds after impact. Even if he blinded Pablo, Gustavo and Roberto were right behind him. The sicarios outside had the compound locked down. Rodrigo might hurt Pablo, but he would die in this jungle. His family in Bogotá would die. His brother, who ran a small grocery store in Bucaramanga, would die. His elderly mother in her apartment in Chapinero would die. Pablo's reputation guaranteed all of this, not as a possibility, as a certainty. And Rodrigo, for all his brilliance, for all his chemical engineering degrees and proprietary refinement processes, was not a man built for martyrdom. His arm dropped, the beaker lowered to the table, his shoulders caved inward. And just that fast, the most dangerous chemist in Colombia became the smallest man in the room. Pablo stepped forward and placed his hand flat on the table, right next to the beaker. He looked at the 4 chemists with the machetes. One by one, the blades clattered to the ground. Each man stepped backward, distancing himself from Rodrigo, rewriting his allegiance in real time with the simple geometry of where he stood. Pablo looked at Rodrigo, just looked at him. Then he said, quietly, almost gently, "Kneel." Rodrigo's legs buckled. He went down, both knees on the dirt floor of the lab he'd built, the lab he'd called his own, surrounded by the chemicals he'd mastered and the process he'd invented. His glasses slipped down his nose. He didn't push them back up. Pablo buttoned his shirt, one button at a time, methodical, unhurried. When he finished, he picked up his rifle from the ground and slung it over his shoulder. Then he said the line, the quiet power line that got repeated in every retelling of this story for the next 30 years. Chemistry is easy. Chemists are cheaper. 7 words, under 15. And he turned and walked out of the building. No explanation, no speech, no monologue about loyalty or consequences. Just those 7 words and the sound of his boots on the jungle floor. Now here's what happened next. And this is the part that separates Pablo from a simple brute. This is the part that reveals the calculations always running behind those flat, dark eyes. He didn't kill Rodrigo. Not that day, not the next day, not the next week. He walked out of the lab, gathered everyone in the compound into the clearing between the buildings and addressed them. He spoke for maybe 90 seconds, short, direct. He told them that the lab would continue operating. Same production schedule, same output targets, but there would be new guards, his guards, and a new head chemist. He pointed at one of the 4 men who'd been standing with machetes minutes earlier, a younger chemist named Fabio, maybe 28, who'd been trained by Rodrigo but had never been the lead. Pablo pointed at him and said, "You run this lab now." Fabio nodded so fast it looked like his head might detach from his neck. Then Pablo turned to Rodrigo, who was still on his knees in the doorway of the processing building. And this is the moment of unexpected vulnerability. The moment that made the men in that clearing more afraid of Pablo than the rifle ever could. Pablo walked over to Rodrigo, crouched down in front of him so they were eye to eye, and said something in a voice so low that only Rodrigo could hear it. Multiple witnesses saw it happen, but none of them could make out the words. Years later, a former sicario who was present claimed that another guard had been close enough to catch part of it. According to that second-hand account, Pablo said, "I know your mother's name. I know where she prays on Sunday. I'm choosing not to visit her. Don't make me change my mind. This is real." That's what genuine power sounds like. Not a shout, a whisper, not a threat against the man. A threat against the man's mother, delivered with the quiet courtesy of a neighbor offering directions. Rodrigo was escorted out of the jungle by 2 of Pablo's sicarios. He was driven to the outskirts of Bogotá and released on the side of the road with nothing. No money, no product, no contacts. Just his clothes, his glasses, and the absolute certainty that every breath he took from that moment forward was a gift from Pablo Escobar. And that's exactly how Pablo wanted it, because a dead chemist tells no stories. A living chemist, walking around Bogotá, visibly diminished, visibly terrified, unable to work for anyone, because the entire underworld now knew he'd tried to cross Pablo and survived only by kneeling on a dirt floor and begging. That chemist tells the best story of all. He tells it just by existing. Every time someone in the trade sees Rodrigo Lara Velázquez shuffling down a Bogotá street with that broken posture and those thick glasses, they remember what happens when you challenge Pablo Escobar. Here's the thing, though. The lab didn't miss a beat. Fabio, the new head chemist, turned out to be nearly as talented as Rodrigo. Within 3 weeks, he had the purity back up to 94%. Not quite 96, but close enough that the American distributors didn't complain. Production actually increased because Fabio, motivated by a potent combination of ambition and absolute terror, pushed the shifts longer and optimized the drying process. Pablo had proven his point. The chemist is not the operation. The operation is the boss. The knowledge, the process, the formula, none of it matters if you don't control the supply chain, the distribution, the protection, the territory. Rodrigo had confused his technical skill with structural power, and that confusion cost him everything. Word spread fast. Within a month, every lab in Pablo's network had heard some version of the story. The details shifted depending on who told it. In some versions, Pablo caught a machete blade with his bare hand. In others, he drank a cup of the sulfuric acid to prove he couldn't be hurt. The truth was dramatic enough, but the exaggeration served Pablo's purpose even better. The mythology grew, the fear deepened, and for the next several years, not a single chemist in the Medellin cartel's network ever raised a word of dissent. You know what's wild? Rodrigo didn't die a violent death. He disappeared into Bogotá's middle class. Some accounts have him working as a private tutor in chemistry. Others say he opened a small cleaning supply business, which, if true, is the kind of irony that writes itself. A man who once produced the purest cocaine in the Western Hemisphere, selling bleach and floor cleaner out of a storefront in southern Bogotá. But here's the thing that sticks with me about this whole story. It's not the confrontation. It's not the open shirt or the spread arms or the 7-word line. It's the walk in. Pablo Escobar walked into a hostile compound, past armed guards who might have been paid to kill him, into a room where 5 men were holding weapons, in an environment where a single gunshot would have turned the air into fire. He walked in alone, unarmed, chest exposed, and the compound folded. Not because he was the strongest man there, not because he had the most guns, but because every person in that jungle clearing understood on a cellular level that Pablo Escobar had already decided how this was going to end. And once Pablo decided something, the universe tended to cooperate. That's not just power, that's something beyond power. That's the kind of authority that turns a man into a legend while he's still breathing. And you know what? If you've made it this far into the story, you're clearly somebody who appreciates the kind of details that most channels skip over. So do me a favor, hit that subscribe button. I've got more stories coming that go deeper than anything you've heard before, stories about the people who built empires and the moments that defined them. One click. That's it, and you won't miss a single one. Now, let me finish this. The Medellin cartel went on to reach its peak in the mid to late 1980s. At its height, Pablo's organization controlled an estimated 80% of the cocaine entering the United States. That's a number so large it almost doesn't register as real. The labs kept running. The chemists kept cooking. The product kept flowing. And in every lab, in every jungle clearing from Meta to Putumayo to Caqueta, the story of Rodrigo and the jungle lab was known. It was the founding myth of Pablo's internal empire. The story that answered the one question every underling eventually asks: what happens if I try to go out on my own? Now, I've told you a lot of stories about a lot of people, but this one sits differently, because it shows you the exact mechanism by which Pablo Escobar built his power. It wasn't money. Money was a tool. It wasn't violence. Violence was a consequence. It was certainty. The absolute unshakable projection of certainty that every situation would resolve in his favor, and the theatrical willingness to bet his own body on that certainty in front of an audience. When he unbuttoned that shirt and spread his arms in that chemical-soaked room, he wasn't being brave. Brave is what you are when you're scared and act anyway. Pablo wasn't scared. He'd already done the math. He knew Rodrigo wouldn't throw the acid. He knew it the way a poker player knows a bluff, reading the tremor in the hand, the moisture on the forehead, the micro-calculations of self-preservation happening behind the man's thick glasses. Pablo read people the way Rodrigo read chemical equations. And in the end, that was the only formula that mattered. Rodrigo thought knowledge was power. He thought being the smartest person in the lab made him irreplaceable. He thought technical skill was leverage. And in a normal world, in a corporate boardroom or a university department, he might have been right. But this wasn't a normal world. This was the Colombian jungle in 1983, and the rules were written by men who carried rifles and settled disputes with gravity and blood. In that world, Pablo Escobar was the only equation that solved. The chemist knelt, the boss walked out, the lab kept running, and the legend grew another layer, another ring on the tree, another story that men would tell in low voices for decades to come. That's the thing about legends. They're not born in victory. They're born in the moment everyone in the room realizes the outcome was never in question, that it was decided before anyone walked through the door. Pablo Escobar decided the outcome of that confrontation the moment Gustavo told him about Rodrigo's betrayal, sitting by that pool, holding his son. Everything after that was just delivery, and Pablo always delivered.